There was a time when walking into Starbucks was like walking into someone's living room. The chair is comfortable, yellow light. The aroma of coffee is rich and captivating. You can sit there for hours, open your laptop, check work, read a book, or just be there. But today, in the same Starbucks, millions of Americans walk in, look around, and ask themselves, what am I paying for? Beneath posts about Starbucks, complaints are increasingly appearing. The prices are too high. The coffee tastes burnt. Most beverages today contain a lot of sugar and artificial flavors. 30 years ago, walking into a Starbucks was like walking into someone's living room. Now, it's like a Burger King store. It's worth noting that Americans haven't turned their backs on coffee. They still drink every day. It's just that they don't drink it at Starbucks anymore. Many people share that. I used to go to Starbucks a lot, but then I realized and started supporting local coffee shops. And I've never regretted it. The price is too high. I prefer to support local businesses. With over 38,000 stores and $36 billion in revenue, Starbucks isn't collapsing due to a lack of funds. They began to slide because they lost something more important: perceived value and emotional attachment. In this video, we'll talk about that paradox. How a brand that once made customers proud to hold their cup in hand became a name that millions quietly ignore. And to better understand this fall of Starbucks, we need to go back in time to the beginning. When Starbucks didn't sell coffee, they sold a sense of belonging. If you look back at Starbucks' early years of success, there's a truth that's rarely stated directly. Starbucks didn't grow because of coffee. They grew by filling a void that American society was lacking: a place to belong. In the 1990s, as America became increasingly urbanized, housing grew more cramped and offices felt cold, Starbucks arrived at just the right moment. They don't identify themselves as a coffee shop, they call themselves the third place. Not home, not work, but an intermediate space where people are allowed stay. The plush armchairs, soft yellow lighting, background music just loud enough to mask the noise, and free Wi-Fi, which at the time was still a luxury. A customer can buy a latte and then sit for 2, even 4 hours, working, reading, or simply watching the world go by outside the glass window. If we understand it in economic terms, Starbucks has done something bold. They sell the right to occupy space. Coffee isn't the main product. It's just the ticket to a rare social experience in modern American life. It was that feeling of security. It felt like a living room, which transformed Starbucks from a place to buy drinks into a way of life. And once it becomes a habit, price is almost no longer a deciding factor. But this is just the beginning. At a time when a cup of coffee at a diner cost only about 50 cents, Starbucks emerged with a price tag of $4.05. It sounds illogical, but they don't sell expensive coffee. They sell a feeling of worth. A Starbucks cup doesn't say, "I need caffeine." It says, "I've worked hard enough to treat myself." Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, Starbucks opened an average of 1 store per day, which is equivalent to America waking up each morning to a new public living room. By 2008, annual revenue reached $0 billion, a figure larger than the GDP of many small countries, just from coffee. The white cup with the blue mermaid became a soft status statement, not as ostentatious as designer brands, but enough to say you have taste, control over your life, and belong to the urban middle class. Starbucks has quietly established an unspoken promise to its customers. We don't just sell drinks, we sell the feeling of being valued. And it was that very promise, not the coffee itself, that was the foundation for the entire empire. And here, a question begins to be asked. What happens when that promise is broken? We will go there in the next part. A message we have for you is, If you want to continue peeling back the business stories hidden behind familiar brands, consider subscribing to the channel. Not to support us, but to not miss the next part of the truth. Let's continue. While there are many analyses of Starbucks' decline, I realized there's an explanation that sounds reasonable but is too simplistic. The pandemic changed everything. But as the facts are followed, the story takes a different turn, and it's much more concerning. The truth is, COVID didn't take down Starbucks. Starbucks has weathered the pandemic very well. What caused their subsequent decline were the decisions made during that period, which were never reversed. During the pandemic lockdown, Starbucks did what any reasonable business would do: optimize for takeout, mobile ordering, drive-through, quick pickup. Everything makes sense in a world where there's no time to sit down. But the problem is, when the world reopened, Starbucks didn't turn back. Instead of reviving the third place model, they doubled down on the speed strategy. A series of stores were renovated. Armchairs disappeared, low tables were replaced with hard chairs, and open spaces were reduced. Some stores are even designed for grab and go, resembling more of a dispensing warehouse than a coffee shop. Some people say Starbucks used to be like a public library that sold coffee. After the pandemic, many places look like airport beverage counters. Alongside this is the expansion of mobile ordering. The proportion of orders placed through the app skyrocketed, at times accounting for nearly a third of all transactions. This helps increase throughput. A store can serve more customers per hour, much like turning a 2-lane road into a 6-lane highway. But highways have an inherent disadvantage. No one stops to admire the scenery. Customers entering Starbucks are no longer greeted with a sense of leisure, but by order display screens, flashing numbers, and an invisible feeling. You're obstructing the flow if you stay too long. And that was the moment Starbucks began to move away from the very thing that made them. Third place just disappeared into silence like that. There was no press release that clearly stated this. There was no grand press conference. There were no goodbyes. It just quietly disappeared. Essentially, third place needs two very simple things: time and permission. Allow the customer to stay, allow them not to rush, allow them to take up space without being pressured to buy more. But the newly redesigned Starbucks is different. Everything from the way the chairs are arranged, the lighting, to the pace of operations whispers the same message. Hurry up. Customer comments began to strangely repeat. The Starbucks we frequent, located inside a Target store, removed all seating several months ago to encourage people to move around more within the store. Now there's no place left to sit and talk. The music is loud, sometimes annoying, and the furniture is uncomfortable in the latest store designs. It feels like they're saying, "Get out." The Starbucks stores in my city have stopped offering seating. Instead, they are just simple counters for you to pick up coffee ordered over the phone. So what's the point of paying $6.08 for a cup of coffee anymore? What's noteworthy isn't the anger, but it's sadness. No one is calling for a boycott. No one got angry. They just said, it doesn't feel the same anymore. That's the most dangerous kind of loss for a brand. The quiet kind. Like an old friend who gradually stops being called by name in the contact list. Starbucks has optimized for efficiency, for the number of orders per hour, for turnaround speed, but in the process, they inadvertently turned third place into a collective memory. Something that once existed, was very real, but no longer has a place in the present. And when a brand builds on emotion, trading emotion for efficiency, the question is no longer whether to do it or not, but rather, how quickly will customers leave, and how silently? In the next part, we'll see what happens when prices rise, experiences decline, and that silence begins to turn into action. This is when the consequences begin to manifest. Not with a sudden crash, but with millions of very small customer decisions. Each decision starting with the same question: is it worth it? For many years, Starbucks had a unique advantage. Customers didn't look at the price, they looked at the feeling. A latte used to be a small daily reward, just like treating yourself to a movie ticket after work. But when prices rise too quickly, that metaphor begins to break down. In just about 5 years, the price of a latte has increased from around $4 to $6.08, which is equivalent to a nearly 40% increase. To put it into perspective, if rent had increased at that rate, the entire United States would have been in an uproar long ago. But with coffee, the resistance happens more subtly in the wallet. 1 glass a day sounds harmless. But when multiplied by 365 days, that number reaches nearly 000 per year. For many middle-class families, this is no longer a treat for themselves, but an expense that needs explaining. More and more comments are appearing. Why pay double for terrible coffee from an even worse company when your local coffee shop can sell much better coffee for half the price and the owner is always friendly? They charge too much for iced coffee and even pressure customers to tip extra. I went there once. $7 for a cup of coffee? I can brew a pot for much cheaper. Never coming back again. I cannot earn 0 an hour there. This is a crucial psychological moment. When customers start calculating, Starbucks loses its biggest advantage. Luxury, even affordable luxury, only exists when the buyer doesn't need to think. Once you have to think, the special feeling disappears, replaced by something more dangerous: regret after spending money. And prices are just the tip of the iceberg. When customers start wondering what they're paying for, they also begin to take a closer look at what's in their cup. Starbucks once built its image as a coffee brand: espresso, ground, beans, flavors. But gradually, the best-selling items became drinks that were structured like desserts. A popular frappuccino contains about 54 grams of sugar, more than a can of Coca-Cola. Some specialty drinks use up to 1830 pumps of syrup. If you translate that into everyday life, it's no longer morning coffee, but a large candy bar diluted with ice. This creates a paradox. Starbucks still prices itself as a premium coffee brand, but its core products are increasingly similar to mass-produced sugary drinks. For health-conscious customers, who were previously the most loyal group, a sense of betrayal is beginning to emerge. No one is stopping Starbucks from selling sweet drinks, but when coffee is no longer the center, the coffee brand loses its very reason for existing. Starbucks inadvertently pushed out coffee drinkers who came for the coffee, while the new customer group who came for the sweets was less loyal, more price sensitive, and more likely to leave. It's a silent trade-off, but extremely costly in the long run. If price makes customers hesitate and the product makes them doubt, then the shopping experience is the final push. Starbucks today is no longer simple. Long menu, endless options, complex application. Customers have to think too much about an action that used to be very instinctive: ordering a cup of coffee. And then there's the tipping screen. Before they could even take their first sip, customers were asked to make a social decision: tip or not tip, 20% or 30%. No one said it directly, but the atmosphere made many people feel like they were being put in an awkward position. It's important to be clear. Customers don't hate baristas. They understand the pressure of work, but they hated the feeling of being forced into a ritual that didn't exist before, especially when prices were already high. The result is a stressful shopping experience. Instead of feeling served, customers leave with a sense of mild manipulation, small enough not to cause outrage, but large enough that they don't want to repeat the experience. 3 factors: rising prices, product deviation, and a confusing experience combine to create a chain reaction. No single factor is enough to kill Starbucks on its own, but taken together, they break the initial promise this brand once made. And when a promise is broken, The question is no longer whether customers will leave, but rather, how quickly will they leave in silence? In the next part, we will trace that silence and how millions of Americans left Starbucks without saying a word. If you want to continue the journey of uncovering the hidden truths behind familiar brands, consider subscribing to the channel. It's not because of us, but because there are still so many stories behind it. In business history, there are two ways a brand loses customers. One is noisy: protests, boycotts, media crises. Two is silence: no complaints, no arguments, just simply don't come back. Starbucks is facing the second scenario, and that's a much more dangerous scenario. The data shows a clear paradox. Americans are not drinking less coffee. That morning habit still exists, as persistent as an alarm clock. What changes is not the need, but the location. For decades, Starbucks has had a near monopoly on one thing: convenience combined with a pleasant experience. But as prices rise, space disappears, the feeling of being there is lost, and that exclusivity dissolves. Customers are starting to find other options, and what's remarkable is that they are much simpler. The local coffee shop is back. No complicated apps, no long menus like airport billboards, just coffee, wooden chairs, and a barista who remembers regular customers. For many, it's the feeling Starbucks once brought, but has lost. The budget chain also squeezed into this gap. McDonald's, Dunkin', and even convenience stores. A $1, 50 cup of coffee, hot, fast, requiring no psychological decision-making. If we were to compare it using a familiar image, Starbucks used to be the weekend diner, but now it has to compete directly with quick lunches during the work week. And then there's the most dangerous opponent: the customer's own kitchen. A coffee maker costing $25 to $300 equivalent to the cost of Starbucks for a few weeks can produce hundreds of cups of coffee. Homemade cold brew only requires water, ground coffee, and time. When YouTube turns everyone into a home barista, Starbucks loses its skill advantage. The key point here is not quality, but it's the feeling of being proactive. Customers no longer feel like they're being lightly pickpocketed every morning. They don't need to ask themselves if it's worth it. And when a brand makes customers feel relieved to leave, that's a red flag. There are no widespread hashtags calling for a boycott of Starbucks. There's no scene of people lining up to return cups. There were no angry statements. There were only very small, strangely repetitive phrases. I just stopped going. I used to go every day. Now This is not resistance. This is coldness. In consumer psychology, anger is still a form of attachment. The angry person still cares. The silent ones don't. Starbucks is losing its most loyal customers, not because they hate the brand, but because they no longer think about it. If we consider the relationship between a brand and its customers to be like a marriage, then this is not a dramatic breakup. This is the scene where two people stop talking, stop asking about each other, stop needing each other, until leaving becomes as natural as a new habit. And what makes this phenomenon frightening is it doesn't give any early warning signs. There was no shock to wake up the management. Only the numbers were steadily decreasing, like water leaking from a large ship. The question now is no longer whether Starbucks can bring customers back, but rather, do they even remember what they promised their customers? And at the end, we'll return to the biggest question. Does Starbucks still have a chance to regain its third place? And what trade-offs would that require? Starbucks hasn't disappeared. They still have tens of thousands of stores, billions of dollars in revenue, and a brand that everyone recognizes in an instant. But the more important question isn't whether Starbucks will still exist, but rather how they still exist in the minds of customers. Americans haven't turned their backs on coffee. They are simply moving away from an experience that once made them feel welcome, included, and valued. When that feeling disappears, the departure doesn't need to be noisy, it just needs to be quiet enough. So, in your opinion, can Starbucks regain its lost third place? Or, in a world optimized for speed, have such slow spaces become relics of the past? Please leave your perspective in the comments section, as this is not just the story of Starbucks, but the story of many other major brands as well. If you want to continue exploring what lies behind familiar numbers, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, not to support us, but to not miss the business stories happening right in front of you that are rarely spoken about directly. The content in this video is analytical and synthesized from public sources, and is not intended to attack or evaluate any individual or organization. All data and opinions are presented for informational and discussion purposes. Thank you for staying with me until the end. See you in the next videos on the channel.